Dr. Kita Park stared at his computer screen for the fifth time that night. The numbers didn't make sense. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked again at the data from Venus. The readings showed something that shouldn't be there: phosphine gas in the planet's clouds. The small office at the Seoul Astronomical Institute was quiet at 3 a.m. Only the soft hum of computers filled the room. Empty coffee cups covered his desk. Papers with complex calculations were spread everywhere. Kita had been working on this project for 3 years, but he had never seen anything like this before. He picked up his phone and called the one person he knew would understand. Dr. Hae-Newell Lee answered on the third ring, her voice sleepy but alert. "Newell, I need you to check something for me," Kita said. "The new data from Venus. I think I found phosphine." There was a long pause on the other end. "That's impossible," Hae-Newell said. "Phosphine shouldn't exist in those conditions. Send me the data." Kita sent the files and waited. His heart was beating fast. Phosphine was important because on Earth, it was made by living things. Finding it on Venus could mean something amazing. 20 minutes later, Hae-Newell called back. Her voice was shaking with excitement. "Kita, I checked everything 3 times. The numbers are correct. There's phosphine in Venus's atmosphere." Kita sat back in his chair, his mind racing. "We need to write this up immediately," he said. "But you know what will happen when we publish. People will say we're wrong." Hae-Newell agreed. "They'll say our equipment made a mistake, or that we did the math wrong." "Let them," Kita said firmly. "We'll show them all our work. Every calculation, every piece of data. We have nothing to hide." Over the next month, Kita and Hae-Newell worked day and night. They checked their findings over and over. They wrote a detailed paper explaining what they found. They knew this discovery could change how people thought about life in space. When they finally published their paper, the response was exactly what they expected. Many scientists said they were wrong. Some were polite about it, others were not. News articles called it controversial and unlikely. "Your career will suffer for this," the Institute's director warned Kita. "You should think about taking back the paper." But Kita stood firm. "The data is correct," he said simply. "I stake my reputation on it." Hae-Newell faced similar pressure. Her funding for other projects was threatened. Other scientists stopped inviting her to conferences, but she never doubted their discovery. "Science isn't about being popular," she told Kita one evening as they reviewed more data. "It's about finding the truth." Months passed. The criticism continued. Kita and Hae-Newell kept working, gathering more data, running more tests. They knew they were right. They just needed to prove it. Then one day, an email arrived from a young scientist named Ji-Ho Kim. She had developed a new way to study planet atmospheres. She wanted to use their data to test her method. Kita read her email with growing hope. Maybe this was what they needed. Someone with a fresh approach. Someone who wasn't afraid to look at things differently. He showed the email to Hae-Newell. She smiled for the first time in weeks. "Reply to her," she said. "Tell her we'll share everything we have." That night, as Kita left the institute, he looked up at the evening sky. Venus was visible, a bright point of light in the darkening sky. He thought about what might be floating in those toxic clouds so far away. "We'll prove it," he whispered to the distant planet. "Just wait and see." The discovery of phosphine on Venus was just the beginning. Kita and Hae-Newell didn't know it yet, but their work was about to start humanity's greatest search for alien life. And it would all start with some unusual numbers on a computer screen at 3 a.m. in Seoul. 3 years had passed since Dr. Kita Park and Dr. Hae-Newell Lee published their controversial findings about phosphine on Venus. The scientific community had mostly moved on to other topics, but their paper wasn't completely forgotten. In a small laboratory in Busan, South Korea, it had caught the attention of someone special. Ji-Ho Kim wasn't like other atmospheric chemists. At 32, She was younger than most of her colleagues, and she looked at problems differently. While others used traditional methods to study planetary atmospheres, she thought there might be a better way. The old methods don't work well for extreme environments, she explained to her research assistant one morning. Venus isn't Earth. We need new tools to understand it. For months, Jai-ho worked on developing a new technique. She used advanced computer models and special equipment she designed herself. Many people told her she was wasting her time, but she didn't listen. One rainy Tuesday morning, everything changed. Jai-ho was running her latest test using data from Venus. The computer program she had written was processing the information in a new way. As she watched the results appear on her screen, her hands began to shake. "This can't be right," she said to herself. She ran the test again and again. Each time, the results were the same. Not only was there phosphine in Venus's atmosphere, but her method showed exactly how it was being produced. The patterns matched biological processes, not chemical ones. Jai-ho immediately called her department head, Dr. Dae Sung-yoon. "I need you to verify something," she said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. Dr. Yoon came to her lab within an hour. He looked at her results carefully, checking every step of her process. After 2 hours, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Jai-ho," he said slowly, "you've just confirmed one of the most controversial papers in recent history, and you've shown how the phosphine is being made." That afternoon, Jai-ho wrote an email to Dr. Park and Dr. Lee. She explained her new method and what she had found. She attached her preliminary results and waited. The response came just 20 minutes later. It was from Dr. Park. "We need to meet. Can you come to Seoul tomorrow?" The next day, Jai-ho found herself in the same small office where the original discovery had been made. Dr. Park and Dr. Lee listened intently as she explained her method. They asked careful questions and examined her data. "Your technique is brilliant," Dr. Lee said finally. "You've done what we couldn't do. You've shown how the phosphine is being produced." "We need to work together," Dr. Park added. "This is too important to do alone." Over the next few weeks, the three scientists combined their efforts. Jai-ho's new method helped them gather more evidence. They found patterns in the data that suggested small but complex organisms were living in Venus's clouds, producing phosphine as part of their life processes. This time, when they published their findings, the response was different. Jai-ho's new method was so thorough and innovative that even the strongest critics had to take notice. Other scientists began to replicate their work, using Jai-ho's technique. One by one, they confirmed what the team had found. The media attention was immediate and intense. Newspapers around the world carried headlines about possible life on Venus. Television stations wanted interviews. Space agencies began calling. "What happens now?" Jai-ho asked Dr. Park one evening as they reviewed the latest data. He smiled. "Now we take the next step. Finding the phosphine was just the beginning. Proving how it's made was crucial. But now we need to see these organisms for ourselves." "You mean send something to Venus?" Jai-ho asked, excitement in her voice. "Yes," Dr. Lee answered. "And I think it's time we talk to Sung-min Choi at the space agency. We're going to need a very special kind of mission." As they discussed their plans, none of them knew they were about to begin the largest international space project in human history. Project Dawn was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. Sung-min Choi sat at the head of a large conference table in the Korean Space Agency headquarters. The room was filled with some of the world's best scientists and engineers. On the wall, a large screen showed the harsh surface of Venus. "We need to build something that has never been built before," Sung-min said, looking at each person in the room. "We need probes that can survive in Venus's atmosphere long enough to find life." Project Dawn had officially begun. After the confirmed discovery of phosphine by Dr. Park's team, space agencies worldwide wanted to be part of this historic mission. Sung-min had been chosen to lead it because of his experience with difficult space missions. He started building his team carefully. First, He called Dr. Yumhee Kang, one of the world's best xenobiologists. She had spent years studying how life might exist in extreme environments. The acid clouds of Venus are unlike anything on Earth, Yumhee explained during her first team meeting. If life exists there, it must be very different from what we know. Next came Tae-Yum Baek, the engineering specialist. He had designed spacecraft that could work in the harshest conditions. His eyes lit up when he saw the project requirements. We need to build probes that can withstand extreme heat, crushing pressure, and acid strong enough to melt metal, Tae-Young said. It's impossible. I love it. The team worked day and night. They designed, tested, and redesigned their probes. Each failure taught them something new. Each success brought them closer to their goal. One evening, as they were testing materials in the lab, a young engineer named Do-hyun Nam had an idea. He had been studying how certain deep-sea creatures protected themselves from extreme pressures. What if we design the probe like a deep-sea fish? Do-hyun suggested. Multiple layers of protection, each one serving a different purpose. The team tried his idea. They created a probe with special layers that could protect the sensitive equipment inside. The outer layer could withstand the acid. The middle layer handled the pressure. The inner layer kept everything cool. Months passed. The team grew larger as more countries joined the project. Scientists from America, Russia, China, and Europe came to help. But the core team remained the same, working together in their South Korean laboratory. This is bigger than any one country, Sung-min told them during a late-night meeting. We're doing this for all of humanity. The first test probe was ready after 8 months of work. They named it Dawn 1. It was beautiful in its own way, shaped like a teardrop and covered in special materials that shimmered in the light. It looks delicate, someone said during the first inspection. That's what makes it strong, Tae-Young replied. It works with Venus's atmosphere instead of fighting against it. The day before the first probe was scheduled to be shipped for launch preparations, the team gathered around it. They had all worked so hard to reach this point. Tomorrow, we start the next phase, Sung-min said. Soon, we'll know if there really is life in those clouds. Dr. Park, who had been invited to see the probe, touched its smooth surface gently. 3 years ago, people said we were crazy for suggesting there might be life on Venus, he said. Now look at what that crazy idea has become. As the team looked at their creation, they knew they were part of something historic. Project Dawn wasn't just about finding life on another planet. It was about humans working together to solve impossible problems. The probe would launch in 2 months. None of them knew if it would succeed, but they had done everything they could to give it the best chance. Now they just had to wait and hope that somewhere in Venus's toxic clouds, their probe would find what they were looking for. The control room at the Korean Space Agency was silent except for the soft beeping of computers. 50 people sat at their stations, all eyes fixed on the main screen. Dawn 1, their specially designed probe, had just entered Venus's atmosphere. Engineer Do-hyun Nam watched the data streaming in from the probe. His heart was beating fast, but his hands were steady on the keyboard. Everything they had worked for came down to this moment. Outer shell temperature normal, he reported. All systems functioning as expected. Project Director Sung-min Choi nodded, his face serious. Take us down to the target altitude, he ordered. The probe descended slowly through Venus's thick atmosphere. Layer after layer of toxic clouds surrounded it. The special materials they had developed were working perfectly, protecting the sensitive equipment inside. Dr. Yumhee Kang studied the atmospheric readings on her screen. We're approaching the phosphine layer, she announced, preparing to collect samples. The room grew even quieter. They had practiced this hundreds of times in simulations, but this was different. This was real. The probe's collection system activated. Tiny amounts of Venus's atmosphere were drawn into special containers inside the probe. At the same time, powerful microscopes began taking images of the surrounding clouds. First sample collected, Yumhee reported. Starting analysis now. Minutes passed like hours. The computers processed the data, comparing what they found with what they expected to see. Do-hyun checked and rechecked the probe's systems, making sure everything was working correctly. Suddenly, Yoon-hee gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth as she stared at her screen. "What is it?" Sung-min asked, moving quickly to her station. "Look," she whispered, pointing to her display. The microscope images from the cloud layer. On the screen, they could see tiny shapes moving in the collected samples. They were small, but they were definitely alive. The organisms looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before, with structures that helped them float in Venus's harsh atmosphere. "Put it on the main screen," Sung-min ordered, his voice shaking slightly. The image appeared on the large display. The entire room fell silent. They were looking at the first alien life ever discovered. "Begin recording all data," Sung-min commanded, recovering his composure. "Document everything. We need multiple confirmations." For the next 6 hours, Dawn-1 collected samples and took images. The organisms appeared in every sample, moving through the clouds, clearly alive and thriving in conditions that would kill any life from Earth. Dr. Ki-ta Park and Dr. Hae-nul Lee had been invited to witness this historic moment. They sat together, watching the screens with tears in their eyes. Their original discovery of phosphine had led to this moment. "They're beautiful," Hae-nul whispered, looking at the strange creatures swimming through Venus's clouds. As news of the discovery spread, scientists around the world began receiving the data. Confirmation came quickly. There was no doubt. They had found life on another planet. The team worked through the night, collecting as much information as possible. They learned that the organisms used the planet's acid clouds for food and energy. They discovered that different types lived at different altitudes, creating a complex ecosystem in Venus's sky. "What do we call them?" someone asked as they studied the images. "Kelis Phenugens," Yoon-hee suggested. "Sky dwellers of Venus." The name stuck. Within hours, it was being used in news reports around the world. Humanity had to accept a new truth. We were not alone in the universe. Life existed in places we had thought impossible. As dawn broke over the control center, Do-hyun looked at the team around him. They were tired but happy. They had done what seemed impossible. They had found life on another world. "This is just the beginning," Sung-min told them. "Now we need to understand how they live, how they evolved, what they can teach us about life itself." The discovery would change everything: science, philosophy, humanity's view of its place in the universe. And it had started with a simple, unexplained reading of phosphine gas, noticed by a dedicated scientist working late at night in Seoul. 2 weeks after the historic discovery of life on Venus, mission specialist Min Seo-wang noticed something wrong with Dawn-2, their second probe. The data coming back showed unusual patterns. The probe's protective layers were failing much faster than expected. "Director Choi, we have a problem," Min Seo said, her voice calm despite her growing concern. She had been monitoring the probe's systems day and night since its launch 3 days ago. "The acid is eating through the outer shell more quickly than our tests predicted." Sung-min Choi came to her station immediately. The numbers on her screen confirmed her fears. The probe's protective layers were dissolving. If they didn't act quickly, they would lose all their expensive equipment and months of work. "How long do we have?" Sung-min asked. "Maybe 6 hours," Min Seo replied. "After that, the acid will reach the inner compartments." The news spread quickly through the control room. Engineer Do-hyun Nam, who had helped design the probe's protection, rushed to join them. He looked at the data, his face growing pale. "This shouldn't be happening," he said. "We tested these materials extensively. Something must be different up there." Min Seo studied the readings more closely. "The acid concentration in this layer of Venus's atmosphere is stronger than our models showed," she explained. "Our test calculations were wrong." The discovery threatened to derail the entire project. Dawn-1's success had led to increased funding and support. But if Dawn-2 failed, People might start doubting their methods. They needed this probe to work. Can we save it? Some men asked the team. Min Seo thought carefully. She had an idea, but it was risky. We could move the probe to a higher altitude, she suggested. The acid is weaker there. It would give us time to figure out what went wrong. But we wouldn't get the deep layer samples we planned for, Do Hyun pointed out. Better than losing the whole probe, Min Seo responded. Sung Min made his decision quickly. Do it, he ordered. Move the probe higher. Min Seo's fingers flew over her keyboard, sending new commands to the probe. They watched as Dawn 2 slowly climbed to a safer altitude. The acid erosion slowed, but didn't stop completely. For the next 3 days, Min Seo barely left her station. She monitored every change in the probe's condition, making tiny adjustments to keep it safe. Meanwhile, Do Hyun and his team worked to understand what had gone wrong. They discovered that Venus's atmosphere was more complex than they had realized. The acid concentrations changed with time and location, creating patches of extremely dangerous conditions. It's like weather patterns, Min Seo explained to a group of concerned international scientists. We need to map these changes before we send more probes. Some people suggested stopping the project until they could develop better protection. Others wanted to continue despite the risks. The pressure on the team grew intense. But Min Seo had another idea. She had noticed something interesting in the data. The Venusian organisms seemed to avoid the most acidic areas. They moved away when acid concentrations got too high. We can use them as guides, she told Sung Min. If we track their movements, we can predict where the dangerous acid patches will form. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. The life forms they had discovered could help them explore their world safely. Nature had already solved the problem they were struggling with. The team began reprogramming Dawn 2 to follow the movements of the Venusian life forms. The crisis had taught them an important lesson. On Venus, they needed to learn from the natives. Sometimes the best solutions come from the biggest problems, Sung Min told his team. We're not just studying life on Venus anymore. We're learning to work with it. Dr. Yoon Hee Kang sat in her laboratory, surrounded by data from the Venus probes. For weeks, she had been studying the strange life forms they had discovered. Now, finally, she understood what made them special. Their entire biochemistry is different from anything on Earth, she explained to Director Sung Min Choi during their morning meeting. These organisms don't just survive in sulfuric acid. They need it to live. Yoon Hee pulled up detailed images on her computer screen. The pictures showed the internal structure of the Venusian organisms, captured by Dawn 2's advanced microscopes. Inside each creature was a complex system that used the acid as part of its life processes. On Earth, acid destroys living things, she continued. But these organisms have evolved to use it as a tool. They take energy from the acid itself. It's remarkable. The discovery changed everything scientists thought they knew about life. For years, they had searched for places similar to Earth, thinking that was where life would be found. But Venus showed them that life could exist in conditions they had thought impossible. Yoon Hee worked with an international team to understand more about these creatures. They learned that the organisms had special outer layers that didn't just protect them from acid. They absorbed it. Inside their bodies, they transformed the acid into energy through a process unlike anything seen on Earth. It's like they're drinking battery acid and turning it into food, she explained to a group of amazed scientists. But for them, it's completely natural. The team also discovered that these life forms communicated with each other. They released small chemical signals into the clouds, warning others about dangerous areas or indicating good feeding spots. It was a simple but effective way of sharing information. One morning, while reviewing new data from Dawn 2, Yoon Hee noticed something extraordinary. The organisms were adapting their behavior based on the probe's presence. They seemed curious about it, gathering around it in groups to study this strange new object in their world. They're more intelligent than we thought, she told her team. They can recognize new things in their environment and respond to them. The news excited everyone involved in the project. These weren't just simple microbes floating in the clouds. They were complex creatures with behaviors that showed signs of basic intelligence. Yoon-hee spent many late nights in her laboratory, documenting everything they learned. She knew this information would change how humans thought about life in the universe. If life could exist in Venus's acid clouds, where else might it be found? We need to rethink what we mean by habitable conditions, she said during a presentation to the World Science Council. Life doesn't need Earth-like conditions to exist. It just needs the opportunity to evolve and adapt. Her work helped create a new field of science, alien biochemistry. Scientists began studying how life might develop in other extreme environments. The methane lakes of Titan, the ice oceans of Europa, the hydrogen-rich atmosphere of Jupiter. One evening, as Yoon-hee prepared to leave her laboratory, she received a message from Dawn 2's monitoring team. The probe had captured images of the organisms gathering in large groups, creating patterns in the clouds that seemed too organized to be random. There's still so much we don't understand, she thought, looking at the images. Every answer leads to new questions. But that was what made the discovery so exciting. They weren't just learning about life on another world. They were learning how much they still had to learn about life itself. Jae-ho Kim stood before a large audience at the International Space Conference. 3 years had passed since the first discovery of life on Venus, and she had an important new theory to share. The room was packed with scientists from around the world, eager to hear her findings. Venus was not always the way it is now, Jae-ho began, showing images on the large screen behind her. Our research suggests that long ago, it was much more like Earth. Her team had spent months studying data from both Venus probes. They had also examined old rocks from Venus that had fallen to Earth as meteorites. These rocks told an amazing story about Venus's past. We found evidence that Venus once had oceans, she explained. The planet had water, just like Earth. But something changed. The temperature began to rise, and the water turned to steam. The steam had created a powerful greenhouse effect, trapping heat and making the planet even hotter. The oceans boiled away completely. The pleasant, Earth-like world became the hot, acid-covered planet they saw today. But life didn't disappear, Jae-ho continued. It adapted. It moved up into the clouds where conditions were better. Over millions of years, it learned to use the acid and heat that would kill other living things. The evidence was clear in the way the Venusian organisms were built. Their bodies showed signs of having evolved from creatures that once lived in water. But instead of dying when their world changed, they had found a new way to live. Dr. Park, who was sitting in the front row, nodded in agreement. This explained why they had found phosphine in the first place. The chemical was a leftover sign from when life had first moved into the clouds. Jae-ho showed more detailed images from Dawn 2. These organisms can teach us something important, she said. Life is stronger than we thought. It doesn't just survive change. It finds new ways to thrive. Her presentation included new information about how the creatures live now. They had developed amazing ways to float in the air, never needing to land. They could share energy with each other, working together to survive in the harsh conditions. But the most interesting thing, Jae-ho said, is what this means for other planets. If life can adapt to such extreme changes, it might exist in places we haven't thought to look. The scientists in the room understood what she meant. If life could survive on Venus as it changed from an Earth-like planet to its current state, then other changing planets might also hold surprises. After the presentation, Jae-ho met with her old colleagues from Project Dawn. They had all come to hear her speak. What you've discovered changes everything, Sung-min told her. We need to look at every planet differently now, including Earth, Hae Newell added. Understanding how life adapted on Venus could help us understand how life might adapt to changes on our own planet. That evening, the team gathered for dinner. They talked about how far they had come since those first uncertain days when they found phosphine in Venus's atmosphere. None of them had imagined then what they would discover. Life finds a way, Jaiho said, looking out the window at the stars. We just have to learn how to look for it. The discovery of how life had evolved on Venus opened new doors in science. Researchers began studying how life might adapt to major changes on any planet. The story of Venus showed them that life was more resilient than anyone had imagined. 20 years had passed since Dr. Kita Park first discovered phosphine in Venus's atmosphere. Now he stood at the observation window of humanity's greatest achievement, Park Station, the first permanent research base floating in Venus's clouds. The station hung like a pearl in the golden sky, protected by the same technology that had made the Dawn probe successful. Its special materials and design allowed it to float safely in the upper atmosphere, where scientists could study the Venusian life forms up close. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," Kita said softly, watching the clouds swirl around the station. Next to him stood Jae-in Cho, a young researcher who represented the next generation of Venus scientists. She had grown up reading about the first Venus discoveries in her school textbooks. "I still remember the day I learned about your discovery," Jae-in told him. "I was 12 years old, and I knew right then that I wanted to study life on other worlds." The station's main laboratory was busy with activity. Scientists from 20 different countries worked there, studying the strange and wonderful creatures that lived in Venus's skies. They had learned so much in the past 20 years, but there was still more to discover. "Look at this," Jae-in said, leading Kita to her research station. On her screen, new images showed something extraordinary. The Venusian organisms were creating complex patterns in the clouds, similar to how birds on Earth flew in formation. "We think they're teaching their young how to navigate the atmosphere," she explained. "They pass knowledge from one generation to the next, just like Earth creatures do." Kita smiled, remembering how far they had come. When he first suggested there might be life on Venus, many people had laughed. Now, humans had a permanent base there, studying a whole ecosystem of alien life. The station had other purposes too. Scientists used it to test new technologies that could help Earth deal with climate change. The Venusian organisms had shown them new ways to handle extreme conditions. Some of their adaptations had inspired solutions for Earth's environmental problems. "Tomorrow, we're launching the new Deep Atmosphere probe," Jae-in said excitedly. "It uses a design based on how the native life forms move through the acid clouds. We think it can reach lower altitudes than ever before." As they talked, a group of students from Earth appeared on the station's main screen. The station regularly connected with schools around the world, letting young people see the wonders of Venus for themselves. Kita loved these sessions. They reminded him why their work was so important. "What's the most surprising thing you've learned about Venus?" one student asked. Kita thought for a moment. "That life is full of surprises," he answered. "Just when we think we understand its limits, it shows us something new." Later that evening, Kita joined the station's crew for dinner. The dining room had a large window showing Venus's eternal sunset. He thought about all the people who had helped make this possible. Hae-Nu Lee, Jae-ho Kim, Sung Min Choi, Yoon-hee Kang, and so many others. "Dr. Park," Jae-in said, interrupting his thoughts. "The next group of research students arrives tomorrow. Would you tell them the story of how this all began?" "Of course," he replied. "They should know that every great discovery starts with someone asking a simple question. What if we're wrong about what's possible?" As night fell on Earth, Park Station continued its endless float through Venus's clouds. Inside, humans worked to understand their first alien neighbors. Outside, the Venusian life forms danced through their acid-filled world, a constant reminder that life could thrive in the most unexpected places. The search for life on Venus had changed how humans saw their place in the universe. It wasn't just a scientific achievement. It was proof that the greatest discoveries happened when people dared to question what they thought they knew.